The first time they laughed was when they saw her stacking clay over a stone box inside her cabin. It was early October, the frost not yet hardened into winter's grip, but the air already carried a weight that told of the coming freeze. Most settlers were chopping wood, caulking their cabins, or patching the cracks left by summer storms. But the widow wasn't fixing what she had. She was building something strange, tall and lumpy like a buried chimney, smeared in wet clay and smoke-stained stone. Marta Petrokina was her name, though half the valley just called her the Russian woman. Her late husband had died the second year after they crossed from New York, and the year after that her oldest boy had gone under the ice trying to fish too soon in spring. Now it was just her and her youngest son, Lev, holed up near the edge of the pine brush line, where the wind funneled strongest off the upper ridges. "She's trying to cook with a chimney turned backward," one man scoffed. Outside Miller's general store. "Built it sideways like a rat tunnel. She'll burn the whole bluff down before December." Others nodded, laughed, agreed, because Marta's design made no sense. Where every other settler had built their stove centered in the room, iron-bellied and venting quick through short pipes, Marta dug downward first, then up, then sideways. A deep firebox at one end of her house, connected to a maze of clay flue tunnels that ran underneath her floorboards, coiled through a cob masonry bench along one wall, then only then rose up into a squat chimney. It wasn't just new, it was wrong, and in the high country of Whetstone Ridge, where timber was precious and time always scarce before snow, wrong meant dangerous. Dangerous meant foolish. Foolish meant alone. But she kept working, slow and methodical, plastering each clay seam with straw and ash, tapping bricks with the bone of her dead husband's old deer-handled hammer, until the whole of it looked less like a stove and more like some buried animal skull unearthed beneath her house. Lev fetched stones. Marta fetched silence. They had no horses, no men, just the deep cold coming, and a clay oven maze inside a cabin the rest of the valley was sure would fail. By November's end, the laughing had stopped, but only because most mouths were too cold to waste breath. The first real snowstorm dropped 12 inches in 2 days, and the second followed so quickly that many couldn't dry out their firewood before the freeze returned. Families from the lower cabins, those closer to the creek and in its shadow, found their floors frosting from the inside out. One man, Jeb Hawkins, caught pneumonia in his sleep and was near gone by the time Doc Mallory reached him. Still, none dared ask Marta how her stove worked. Pride, perhaps, or just the stubborn blindness of men who'd already decided she was the sort of woman who wouldn't last through a second winter. But she was lasting, and Lev's boots didn't crunch when he stepped outside. They thumped, heavy, warm, always dry. Marta's chimney gave off no roaring smokestack, only the faintest breath of steam and soot. No roaring fire inside either. Her stove never blazed, but it glowed, constantly, night and day, fed not in roaring piles of logs, but in handfuls of split pine and brushwood, and always kept burning, banked like a sleeping animal's heart, pulsing heat from underneath the cabin's core. Her floorboards were warm, her walls didn't sweat with cold, and when 3 other cabins suffered burst pipes and splintered joists during the Christmas freeze, Marta's stood unmoving, quiet as stone, and just as solid. That's when the widow's stove stopped being funny. By January, people began to notice the footprints near her house, not just Lev's, not just Marta's, but others, neighbors who hadn't spoken to her in months now lingering outside her door, eyes cast downward, breath held awkward. Most didn't knock. A few did, but none said much beyond polite nothings. Not yet. The day old George Burnley's stove caught fire and took half his roof with it. His daughter rode half the ridge in snowshoes, asking if anyone had clay to spare. She never once mentioned Marta by name, but everyone knew where she meant. Marta didn't come down to the store anymore, didn't need to. Lev made their trips quick, focused, and with eyes that didn't dart or fidget like a boy's should. He always brought back flour, candles, salt, and 1 small tin of kerosene. He never bought wood. People noticed that too, but no one asked, not even when Marta built a second bench bed of stone inside the cabin, warmed by the same flue line that coiled under her stove. A bench shaped like a daybed, thick with fur pelts, where she let Lev sleep during the worst of the January freeze. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There were no town meetings or confrontations, just a slow folding of one winter into the next, and an admission, not spoken but felt, that the widow might not be foolish at all. What changed it all was the baby. Clara Mallory, Doc's daughter, had given birth in the early days of February. The child was small, sickly, came 3 weeks too early, during a night where the frost etched feathers on the inside of the cabin glass. Their own stove wasn't enough. The room was 34 degrees even with fire. The baby turned blue by dawn. Doc, old and stiff with regret, had never once spoken to Marta beyond nods since her husband's death. But that morning, he didn't hesitate. He hitched his mule to a sledge, and wrapped the baby in every fur and quilt he could find. He said nothing when he knocked at Marta's cabin. She opened the door. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She stepped aside, and within 5 minutes, the child was inside, layered on Lev's stone bed and wrapped in the gentle breath of radiant clay-warmed air. It was 75 degrees inside Marta's cabin. Doc's daughter cried when she stepped in, not from cold, from relief. That night the wind howled so hard it lifted snow in walls. It screamed across the ridge like a dying man and cracked the eaves of every low-roofed cabin, but not Marta's. Her cabin hummed low, steady, like it was breathing, and when morning came, the child was pink, alive. By the next week, 6 more families had asked if she would teach them how to build one. She said no, not because she was cruel, but because her stove had taken her 3 years to learn and 2 winters of pain to perfect. "You cannot build it in 1 week, she told Mrs. Coates, the baker's wife. "It must be in your bones." And that was when people realized Marta hadn't been building a stove. She had been building memory, a structure meant not just to burn, but to remember how to burn slowly, constantly, wisely, like the ones her grandmother taught her. Before the crossing, before America, before death, her stove wasn't an invention. It was an inheritance, one the rest of the valley had forgotten. The thaw came late that year, late and bitter. Even by March, drifts still curled up against the south-facing cabins like sleeping bears, and half the valley had taken to breaking holes in the crusted snow with iron shovels before stepping out each morning. Trees bent under the weight of ice that should have melted weeks before, and the stream that split the lower valley roared with meltwater only at noon, freezing again by sundown. But in Marta's cabin, the floor never froze once, not once. Inside her thick plastered walls, the clay coils of the stove held heat like coals inside a buried oven. Lev had taken to calling it the Mother, a name whispered only to himself and never outside, as though naming it in public would make it sound strange. Marta never corrected him. She just kept it burning, never higher than needed, never out, always steady. That spring, folks stopped laughing altogether. Not just because they knew better now, but because they needed her. Every single homestead on Whetstone Ridge had suffered something. Broken beams, warped floorboards, chimney rot, wood stores half-melted and mold-stained from the freeze-thaw swings. Several cabins had grown such thick indoor frost that bread molds had frozen in strange crystalline webs along the ceiling joints. But not Marta's. And when Doc Mallory reported that Clara's child had put on more weight in 3 weeks than any winter-born infant he'd treated in 10 years, he mentioned, just once in passing, that the child had slept near a Russian stove. That's when the name took hold. It wasn't Marta's stove anymore. It was the Russian stove, spoken low, respectful, with a kind of measured awe, and yet she had no pride in it, no boast. She never once used it to hold herself above the others. When Mrs. Langtry offered her 3 bolts of cloth for blueprints, Marta declined gently. "It is not a drawing," she said. "It is a way of thinking. I cannot give it on paper." When young Tom Sweeney tried to sketch it from memory, after a single visit, he brought his notes to the general store, laid them out on a whiskey barrel, and explained with his chest puffed how the tunnel-style combustion route worked. He lasted 10 minutes before the drawing fell apart under questions. Where does the draft go if you stack the bench too close to the wall? How do you prevent backsmoke if the fire's too low in the flue line? What keeps the floor from buckling? Tom's answers were guesses, mostly bad ones. He stopped sketching after that, but Marta noticed the boy's effort. One afternoon, she sent Lev down to their cabin with a folded cloth packet. Inside was a wedge of baked clay and a small flint striker. Nothing more, but stitched into the cloth was a single word in Cyrillic. Domovoy, little house spirit. Lev said she told him, if he wants fire, he must learn to ask it kindly. By April, thaw gave way to mud. The worst season on the ridge wasn't winter, it was after. Meltwater soaked the lower trails so badly that wagons sank axle deep, and even highland cabins dealt with shifting foundations, runaway drainage, and collapsed outbuildings. And that's when Marta's stove taught the town its second lesson. Not warmth, weight. Her stove, buried so low and built so broad, had balanced the whole cabin, while others watched their homes creak and list under the wet shift of earth. Hers held fast. It sat on a base of compressed clay and stone, its weight redistributed in such a way that the cabin above floated on heat and mass like a raft tethered to bedrock. Mrs. Coates's house, by contrast, leaned sideways by 5 degrees before spring even finished. Her stove had sunk into rotted wood. She sent her boy down with an apology and asked, this time humbly, if she could watch Marta build. Marta let her come. Not to learn, not yet, just to watch, and only if she was willing to sit silent. Mrs. Coates brought bread, sat cross-legged in the doorway, said not a word for 4 hours as Marta split clay with a wire and mixed it with ash and dried grass. She watched how Marta heated small stones, then cooled them in oil, then placed them inside a hollow under the firebox where she said, "The breath gathers. The stove breathes," Mrs. Coates whispered. Marta didn't nod or smile, but she didn't say no. By late spring, there were whispers that Marta's stove might hold secrets deeper than clay. Some said it was ancient knowledge from the Volga river valleys. Others whispered about her grandmother having once survived an Arctic collapse in Siberia, burning lichen in a domed hut for months. There were no records, of course, no books, just the way she built, the way she worked the clay with her bare hands, not trowels, the way she stopped work entirely if someone entered the cabin angry or loud. "Fire is gentle," she told Lev once, loud enough for the schoolteacher to hear when he came by asking about energy efficiency. "But only if you treat it like a sleeping animal. You wake it wrong, it bites." The teacher left with a red face, but Marta didn't gloat. She wasn't proud, just patient. When the snows returned the next winter, sooner than expected, mid-November instead of December, two families had tried building imitations. Both failed. One stove smoked so badly it choked the room by dawn. The other refused to hold heat and cooled in hours. Marta said nothing when asked. She didn't volunteer corrections. She only helped when asked correctly. When Mrs. Coates returned, hat in hands, and said, "I don't want to borrow your stove. I want to earn it," Marta finally let her join the work. "Bring your daughter," she said, "and wear old clothes." She showed them how to mix clay properly, how to feel the balance of ash and straw by the way it crumbled when dry. She didn't explain everything, but she let them do, and that was enough. The stove they built didn't match Marta's, but it held heat, it warmed the floor, it glowed at night, and it became the second Russian stove on the ridge. By the third winter, 6 more families had built stoves in the same style. Lev, now taller and stronger than most boys his age, began hauling heavier stones and climbing rooftops to adjust chimney caps. He never claimed to be an expert, but he watched, learned, and could patch a flue in half the time it took a grown man. The town stopped calling Marta foolish. They started calling her wise. By the 4th year, the general store carried bags of fire clay and straw bundles during autumn, stocked alongside salt pork and kerosene. They labeled it stove mix, though everyone knew where it came from, and the old scoffs had turned to questions. How does the flue curve at the back corner? Do you seal with ash or mud? Does it really use half the wood? And each time the answer was the same. "You'll have to ask Marta. She never once advertised, never charged for knowledge, but she didn't give it lightly. You had to earn it, you had to watch, and you had to treat fire like a guest, not a slave, because that was the secret in the end. Not the clay, not the chimney. It was the way she treated it, like something living, sacred." The settlers had laughed once. Now they built stone benches inside their cabins with pride. Now they whispered about draft flow and thermal mass. Now they kept their floors warm and their babies alive in the deadest cold, all because a widow once built a backwards chimney, and no one could forget it. By the 5th winter, nobody laughed at her. Not the men who had once scoffed outside the general store, not the preacher who'd once joked about foreign devils burning their smoke backward, and certainly not the merchant who now stocked red-banded flue tiles cut at Marta's preferred 9-inch depth. The laughter had long ago frozen in place, shattered by the hard weight of survival, and the old scorn had thawed into something quieter. Curiosity, yes, but also respect, maybe even reverence, because Marta's cabin had not merely survived, it had taught, and the widow herself had become something more than just a figure on the ridge. She was still quiet, still rarely spoke more than needed, but when she did, people leaned in. When she built, they watched. And when she lit her stove on the first cold night of each winter, several neighbors found themselves standing outside their cabins, in silence, listening for the low thump of clay taking flame through the drawpipe, like they were waiting for a church bell. It had been 5 years since her husband's death, 4 since Lev had nearly frozen his feet after falling through river ice, 3 since Doc Mallory had carried a gasping infant into her house like a broken bird, and walked out with it pink and breathing. And now, there were 11 Russian stoves across the valley. 12, if you counted the one built in the schoolhouse, though it didn't work quite right, and everyone said it smoked in the mornings when the wind shifted. That one hadn't been built by Marta. She had offered to help, but the teacher had declined. Too proud, too eager to try it alone with help from a book and some diagrams a cousin had sent from back east. Marta said nothing, but she didn't visit again. Lev did, quietly. One evening, he patched the chimney's second bend and resealed the fire brick with a thicker slurry of ash and river sand. It helped somewhat, but the teacher never said thank you. That didn't matter to Lev. Marta had taught him. You don't give warmth for thanks. You give it because the world is cold. The day the preacher's roof collapsed, Marta was stirring dough. It was the 3rd week of December, and the snow had fallen all night, soft and thick like ash from a deep burn. The kind of snow that smothered sound, that pressed weight into wood and fiber and frozen bark. The wind had died, but the weight of the storm was worse without it. Quiet, heavy, dangerous. Most settlers had stayed indoors, banking fires and listening to the creak of beams above. But at dawn, there was a crash, then shouting. The church cabin's entire front roof had caved under the wet snow. No one was inside but Preacher Dunlop and his wife. Both were bruised, but alive. Their iron stove, however, had cracked in two, and the chimney pulled halfway off its anchor. The flue pipe lay buried in splintered boards. Worse still, the back corner of the cabin had split open, and the preacher's wife, an old woman with trembling legs, had wept at the cold wind that came rushing in. People came to help, of course. They cleared beams, dragged what they could into the barn. But no one knew where to house the Dunlops, not with cabins already full and snow blocking half the roads. Until Lev arrived. He didn't speak to the preacher, didn't say anything dramatic. He just walked up to Marta, whispered something, and she nodded. Then he turned to the gathered neighbors and said, "There's space. Our bench is warm." He helped the preacher walk the half-mile up to Marta's cabin, through drifts that reached his waist. He carried the wife on his back for most of it, and when they arrived, Marta didn't greet them like guests. She simply opened the door, held it with her shoulder, and gestured toward the stone bench, already warm. She had baked rye flatbread that morning. The stove's outer wall radiated a soft heat. The cabin glowed. The Dunlops stayed 2 nights. When they left, the preacher didn't mention God once. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't try to repay her. But he did walk into the general store the next day and buy 5 bags of stove clay, 2 boxes of sand, and a chisel. He said only one thing: "I was wrong," and that was more than enough. But not every settler was won over by warmth. There were still a few, men like Cobb Salters, who lived on the northern ridge, a hunter by trade and solitude by nature, who refused to change their ways. He burned 4 times the wood Marta did, had to rebuild his flue every second spring. But he'd once fought in Kansas during the border wars and had a hatred for anything that smelled foreign. When the others built their Russian stoves, Cobb spat in the dirt and said, "You gonna start eating cabbage soup too?" Nobody argued. They let him be. But that winter, when his daughter fell sick with lung fever, he came down the ridge like a madman, on foot, boots wrapped in rawhide, shouting for help. Lev heard him first. Marta was already gathering herbs and warming broth. By the time Cobb reached their door, red-eyed and shaking, the cabin was already lit. The girl, barely 11, was laid on the warm stone bench within 5 minutes. She stayed 5 days. Marta tended her like she was blood, rubbed tincture on her chest, kept the stove at a low, steady glow, fed her broth 1 spoon at a time. When she left, she could breathe again. Cobb didn't say thank you, didn't ask for help building a stove. But the next month, Lev saw him hauling clay up the ridge on a makeshift sled, and by the year's end, his firewood usage had dropped by half. It wasn't just about heat. That's what people began to realize. The stove was warmth, yes, but it was discipline. It was understanding. You couldn't just pile logs into it and expect magic. You had to learn how to tend it, when to feed, when to bank, how to adjust the drawer, how to use small fuel smartly, how to let stone hold the heat and breathe it back slow. The Russian stove wasn't just survival. It was patience turned into architecture. By the 6th winter, there were 19 stoves on the ridge. Lev had helped with 13 of them, Marta, 6, and every one of them worked differently, slightly tuned to the house, to the owner, to the materials. Marta never used the word perfect. She said only, "If it glows at night and your baby doesn't cry, it is enough." Families who had once frozen through January were now sleeping warm through February. Children who had once shivered in corners now sat barefoot on stone benches, smiling. And settlers who had once scoffed at clay now traded in it like gold. But still, no one had matched Marta's stove, because hers was more than craft. It was story, built from memory, tempered by loss, and tended every night with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had once held her dying son's feet in her hands and whispered prayers to a fire no one else understood. One spring, Lev came home late. He was older now, nearly grown, broad-shouldered, quiet like his mother but stronger in voice. He'd spent the day helping the Jenkins family pour clay for a new floor channel. But when he came through the door, Marta didn't greet him. She was sitting on the floor, one hand on the clay near the stove's base, eyes closed. "Is it broken?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, it's breathing shallow." She meant the stove. Lev crouched beside her. The air was still warm, but the drawer felt different. Sluggish. He checked the draft, pulled out the ash. Nothing blocked. "It's clean," he said. She looked at him, tired. "Yes, but it's old, like me." He didn't answer. The stove had never failed them, but Marta had built it with her husband's hands, years ago, in grief and in survival. Maybe it was wearing out, or maybe Marta was. That night, Lev sat up late, feeding it with finer wood, adjusting the air intake, listening. The stove didn't roar, but it glowed, and in that glow, he saw the shape of his childhood, the shape of his mother's hands, the shape of every winter they had survived. He made a decision. He would build another, not to replace the old one, but to learn it fully, completely. Marta smiled when he told her. "Good," she said, "but you build it your way." He nodded, and she said one last thing before blowing out the candle. "Make it warm enough to carry the weight of others." Lev built his stove in silence, not in solitude. There were always neighbors coming by, offering help, watching curiously, bringing baskets of dried apples or hunks of cured pork as if he were setting up a wedding fire. But he built it quietly, intentionally, like prayer. He chose a patch of land not far from his mother's cabin, slightly downhill, where the earth sloped into a natural hollow. The wind didn't scream there, just moaned low and distant, like a child under quilts. Lev cleared the land himself, dug deep, and hauled his own stone. He refused to borrow any of the clay his mother had stored, said he needed to learn how it feels to find it right. And so he did. He tested different banks along the riverbed, comparing each with a pinch between fingers, watching how they crumbled. After a day in the sun, some cracked too brittle, some stayed damp too long, but one, just past the split pine near the old homestead trail, had the right color, deep gray, almost blue when wet, cold, heavy, pure. He dug it by hand, mixed it with straw and ash the way Marta had shown him, but not exactly the way she did. He didn't use her old mixing stone. He built a trough instead, lined it with canvas, and stirred the blend with a long-handled scoop carved from maple. It took longer, but it felt right. Marta visited once, just once. She stood at the edge of the worksite, watching him lay the first of the fire bricks, triple stacked, in a shape slightly narrower than hers, with a longer underfloor flue. "You're making the belly too lean," she murmured. He paused, smiled, and replied, "I want it to breathe deeper." She didn't argue, just nodded, turned, and left. He built the stove over the course of 22 days, slept nearby, under a tarp, tending a small fire, for warmth and watching the frost patterns each morning, studying how the cold gathered, how the sun hit the flue line, how water pooled after snowmelt. By the end of the third week, the base chamber was sealed, the flue coiled under the future bed bench. The firebox door, an iron square he had forged himself at the old blacksmith's ruins, was mounted. He waited 3 days before lighting the first flame. When it burned, it didn't roar, it pulsed, a low, steady rhythm drawn by the longer flue and deeper belly. The heat didn't rush, it lingered, it settled. He called it the sleeping bear. Neighbors came, some brought food, others just sat on stones outside, watching the faint trails of warm air drift from the vent pipe. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a spectacle, but by the end of that first night, 4 people asked Lev to help them build one. He said no, not out of pride, but because he hadn't come to teach yet. He had come to remember. Marta's health began to shift in the spring. It wasn't sudden, not sickness, not a collapse, just a slowing. She moved less, stayed by the stove more. Her hands, once strong as a mule's jaw, now trembled when mixing clay. She still spoke plainly, still sharp, but when Lev brought her a bowl of porridge one morning and she didn't lift it, he understood without asking. Her time was folding in. She wasn't dying, but she was fading. She watched him work from the cabin window, watched neighbors pass with tools and baskets, watched young girls who'd once been bundled babies now drag sleds of stone to help their parents build flue tunnels. The world was shifting, and her place in it, she sensed, had been handed forward. One night Lev came inside late, covered in soot and snowmelt, and found her sitting at the base of the old stove, hand pressed to its warm stone. "You finished your bear?" she asked. He nodded. "It sleeps better than I do," she smiled, then whispered, "Build one more." It tilted his head. "For who?" She turned her palm to the warm bench, tapped it once. "For me." The final stove they built together wasn't meant to heat a family. It wasn't for children or guests or storage. It wasn't meant to be efficient or clever. It wasn't for teaching or showing. It was hers. Lev tore up the floor in the cabin's back corner, where she had once kept her husband's spare tools. The room was small, only 10 feet across, but it faced east. Sunlight came through first thing each day, painting the walls gold before fading toward noon. They dug the flue channel together, side by side. He did the lifting, the hauling. She sat on a low stool, directing. "Lower there. No, not too sharp. Let the air turn, not crash." They placed each stone with care. The clay mixture they used had been dug months earlier and sealed in a barrel. Lev had saved it, just in case. When the base was done, they spent 2 more days sealing the belly. He asked her if she wanted the stone bench raised high. "No," she whispered. "I want to feel the earth when I sleep." So he built it low, almost ground level, just tall enough for a blanket, just wide enough for one. When it was finished, they lit the first flame together. It took quickly, burned bright, then dimmed to a hum, and the warmth, that filled the small room was different than any stove he'd built before. Not heat, presence, as if the clay itself remembered her, as if the flue knew every breath she'd taken these past 6 winters and was whispering them back, one curl of heat at a time. She slept on that bench that night, and every night after. Lev became the builder then, not just in name, in need. Families called for him. Some brought money, some brought bread, some just brought stories. He didn't copy his mother's stove. He built each one unique, learned the shape of each house, studied the flow of air, the direction of snow melt, the way frost gathered on certain windows before others. He built stoves that fit the family, stoves that breathed like the rooms they lived in. And always, he built them with the same rules. No rushing, no roaring, no shortcuts. Fire, he said, was a guest, and you don't feed a guest by throwing logs at its feet. By the 7th winter, there were 32 Russian stoves in the valley. The general store sold flue stone by the ton. The preacher taught fire tending at Sunday meetings. Children were raised knowing how to check the drawer with a feather, how to seal ash with oil-soaked cloth, how to place their hand to the bench and feel not just warmth, but balance. No one built iron stoves anymore, not after what happened to the widow Canfield's boy, trapped against a hot plate when the iron cracked and flamed out. His back never healed right. Lev built her a stone stove that spring, quiet, low, gentle. The boy slept by it every night after. And when Marta passed, quietly in her sleep, hand resting on the clay bench, in the eastern room, Lev kept the fire going until morning. Neighbors came in silence, paid respects, placed small stones on the bench beside her. It wasn't a funeral, it was a return. Her body was wrapped in linen and buried in the clay pit she once dug from. The same blue clay that had sealed her first stove now sealed her grave. And above it, Lev built a marker, not of wood, not of iron, but of stone, 2 fire bricks, angled upward, sealed in ash, and set with a copper ring. At its base, he etched only one line. She taught fire to sleep. The winter after Marta died was the coldest the ridge had seen in 50 years. The children were the ones who held her memory best. They had not grown up with iron stoves or roaring fires that ate logs like hunger. They had grown up with the quiet hum of stone, with warm benches, with walls that breathed heat at night like old giants sighing. They were the first generation to live without fear of freezing. And so, in their innocence, they celebrated her. That winter, the school teacher, having long since admitted the failure of his iron stove and the genius of the Russian designs, suggested something no one had done before. A day of thanks, not a holiday, not a festival, just a day when each family would tend their fire early, then gather at the schoolhouse to share bread and stories. A fire day. It wasn't declared officially. No one voted on it, but they all came. On the first Saturday of January, they gathered in the schoolhouse, now warmed by a Russian stove that Lev had rebuilt himself the year before. Long bench seats lined with quilts, bread set out on thick boards, children wrapped in wool, no ceremony, no prayers, just warmth and stories. One by one they stood and spoke, not long speeches, just memories. Old George Burnley talked about the year his cabin burned down and how Marta took in his granddaughter before the new walls were even framed. Mrs. Coates spoke about the winter she cried alone in her barn, thinking she had failed her children, and the way Marta had sat beside her and said, "A cold stove does not mean a cold heart." Even Cobb Salters, grizzled now and slower on his feet, stood and cleared his throat like it hurt. He muttered something about clay and stubbornness, then sat down, red-faced and blinking hard. The children clapped. Lev didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what he carried. He sat quietly near the rear stove, hand resting on its stone lip, watching as the heat rose and curled in slow arcs through the room like ghosts made of breath. That night, he walked home alone. Snow fell soft and vertical. In his mother's cabin, the one she had built with her own calloused hands, the one whose stove had never gone cold for over 3 decades. He sat at the edge of the fire bench and placed a single log on the coals. Not pine, not oak, just a thin sliver of aspen. It flared gently. The room glowed. And in that moment, he remembered every winter. Every burn, every breath of warmth she had made from nothing. He whispered one word, "Thank you." Years passed. The world outside Whetstone Ridge changed. Trains came. New settlers arrived with new ideas, new stoves, new metals, new ways. Some laughed again at the old clay ovens. Some brought books that claimed their iron box heaters were more efficient, more modern, more civilized. But they didn't understand the wind. They didn't understand the way the snow bent around the ridge and how frost crept under wood faster faster than fire could catch. They didn't understand what it meant to keep heat inside the bones of your home, not just in a metal belly roaring in the corner. And when the first iron stove cabin buckled during a deep freeze, and the baby inside it caught frostbite on both feet, they came back to Lev, to the stoves, to Marta's way, not because it was romantic, because it worked, and no one could argue with 30 winters of warm babies, strong beams, and full lives. One day, a stranger came. He was from the east, tall and smooth-handed, wearing wool too fine and boots too clean, said he was writing a book about frontier technologies, said he wanted to record the folk designs that had proven effective in edge communities. He had a clipboard, asked too many questions, measured things, tried to sketch diagrams of the stove in Marta's old cabin. Lev let him. But when the man asked why no one had standardized the design, why there was no central blueprint for the Russian stove, Lev led him outside and pointed at the cabins across the ridge. Each one had a chimney, each one had a story, each one burned differently. You don't standardize a heartbeat, Lev said. The man left with his notes, never published the book, or if he did, no one ever read it in Whetstone Ridge. In time, Lev became the old man. Children ran past his cabin now, barefoot even in early winter, shouting, laughing, never afraid of the cold. Their mothers cooked on. Stone benches that held heat from dawn till dusk. Fathers worked the clay pits with reverence. And when Lev's back grew too stiff to dig, the valley returned the favor. They brought him food. They brought him news. They brought him the first newborn each spring to hold, even if just for a minute. And in every cabin he stepped into, he found her. In the warmth, in the stone, in the quiet hum of fire, sleeping soundly under a dozen feet. They called her name less now, but they lived her wisdom. And that was more than any grave or statue could carry. One last thing. There was a girl, small, dark-haired, curious beyond reason. She watched Lev rebuild a stove one year in the far corner cabin near the ravine. She sat each day on the same stump, notebook in her lap, scribbling everything. She asked smart questions. She didn't interrupt. And on the final day, when the last brick was placed and the draft caught like a whispered prayer, she asked, "Did Marta ever build one just for beauty, not just warmth?" Lev paused, then nodded. "She built one stove," he said, "with blue tiles, glazed, just for joy." The girl wrote that down carefully. Years later, that girl would go on to build stoves of her own, half a continent away, in places where the winters howled differently but the cold meant the same. And in every stone she laid, she whispered the name of a woman she'd never met. Because fire travels, and so do stories. And on Whetstone Ridge, in the cabin built with hands bruised by time, an old stove still breathes. It doesn't blaze, it doesn't roar, but on the coldest nights, when the wind sharpens like glass and trees scream with ice, the stove hums, and the room glows, warm, alive, remembering.